All right, let's dive into prisons today.
Sounds good.
We're tackling Michel Foucault and his book Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison.
Oh, Foucault. This will be good.
It really makes you rethink how you see the whole system.
Yeah, it's not just about locking people up. It's a whole way of thinking about power and control.
So we're going beyond just like the history of prisons,
Yeah.
right? We're looking at how they're connected to like bigger societal forces.
Right. Foucault argues that prisons are part of this thing he calls disciplinary power.
Disciplinary power.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for us.
It's like this way of shaping people's behavior, not just through physical punishment,
Okay.
but through things like surveillance and strict rules, like,
Oh, I see.
how schools have timetables or workplaces track your productivity. It's
Yeah.
those kinds of things.
It's like the system itself is trying to control us, even in subtle ways.
Exactly.
Makes you think, right?
It does, and it connects to this other big idea from Foucault,
Yeah.
the delinquent.
Right, the delinquent. It's like someone's whole life becomes part of how they're punished.
Yeah, it's not just about the crime itself, it's about the person's whole history.
It's getting a little creepy now.
I know, right? Like they're trying to predict and manage behavior based on your past.
And Foucault talks about how early prisons actually used these systems to keep track of prisoners' behavior.
They were obsessed with documenting everything, almost like trying to make it a science.
A science of delinquency. That's kind of scary.
It is a little bit, yeah. But they also thought they could reform people this way. That's where the idea of isolation comes in.
They really believed that prisons could change people from the inside out.
Yeah, it was all about discipline and transforming the person. And this brings us to one of Foucault's most famous ideas, the panopticon.
Oh yeah, the panopticon, that creepy prison design where you're always potentially being watched.
Exactly. The architect, Jeremy Bentham, thought constant visibility would make people behave better.
It's like the ultimate symbol of disciplinary power, isn't it?
Totally. The crazy thing is, we see echoes of the panopticon everywhere now.
Oh, I know, right? Surveillance cameras, social media. It's like we're all living in a panopticon now.
It's like you never know who's watching you. It makes you think about how this affects our behavior even when we're not actually being monitored.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling. It makes you wonder if we've traded privacy for a false sense of security.
Good point. And speaking of different approaches to control and reform, Foucault talks about these two competing prison systems in the U.S., the Auburn and Philadelphia models.
Okay, I vaguely remember those from a history class. Refresh my memory.
Well, the Auburn model was all about strict routine, like individual cells at night, but working and eating together in silence.
So it's like a mix of a monastery and a factory, all about discipline and order.
Exactly. The Philadelphia system, on the other hand, was all about solitary confinement, like complete isolation.
Wow, that's intense. They thought that would lead to like spiritual reflection and change.
Yeah, that was the idea. So you have these two models, both using isolation, but with different goals.
It really shows how complicated this whole idea of prison reform is, doesn't it?
For sure. And then there's the whole question of work and the prison. Foucault argues that work became a central part of the whole system.
They saw it as a way to teach discipline and skills, right? Like reform through labor.
Yeah, but that idea was also super controversial. Critics argued that it was basically exploiting prisoners.
They were worried prisons would turn into workhouses where people were forced to labor for almost nothing.
Exactly. And they worried this system would actually make poverty and crime worse, not better.
So even back then, people were debating the ethics of prison labor.
Absolutely. And then there's this whole question of the so-called failure of prison, which Foucault has a really interesting take on.
Yeah, he challenges this idea that prisons are supposed to eliminate crime, right?
He's like, maybe the goal isn't to get rid of crime entirely. Maybe it's to create this manageable category of delinquency.
So the system isn't trying to eliminate crime, it's just trying to control and manage it.
Right, and that raises some really uncomfortable questions.
Like, who benefits from having this permanent criminal underclass?
Exactly. It forces us to think about the power dynamics at play and whose interests are really being served.
Wow, this is getting pretty deep.
It is. Foucault's work always makes you think about things in a whole new way.
This is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? You've got a lot more to unpack.
We do. Foucault's ideas go way beyond the prison walls. We'll dive into that after the break.
Stay tuned, folks. This is going to get good.
Welcome back, folks. Before the break, we were talking about how prisons might not be about getting rid of crime, but actually like creating this category of delinquency to manage and control.
Yeah, and Foucault doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
He says this prison influence, it goes way beyond just the physical buildings.
So it's not just about the bars and the cells.
Right. He talks about this carceral archipelago.
Carceral archipelago. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one.
Basically, it's this whole network, like a system that includes not just prisons, but places like reformatories, workhouses, hospitals.
Even hospitals, yeah. And even schools to some extent.
Wow, I wouldn't have thought of schools as being part of that.
They might seem different, but Foucault argues they all use these similar techniques, for control.
So it's like this hidden web of institutions all working together to shape us.
Exactly. It blurs the lines between punishment and treatment, even just like social control in general.
It's kind of scary when you think about it that way.
Yeah, Foucault uses this example of the Mettray penal colony in France.
Okay.
It was supposed to be for reforming young people, but it was like this crazy military regime.
Like boot camp?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
It's just another example of how easy it is to control people under the guise of helping them.
That's messed up.
Yeah.
But even with systems like this, there's always pushback, right?
Of course. Foucault talks about how the prison system has faced resistance from the start.
Like those worker movements we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, they saw what was happening, the exploitation of prisoners, the horrible conditions.
They were connecting the dots between poverty and crime,
Right.
saying it wasn't just about individual choices.
Exactly. And some groups, like the Fourierists, went even further. They said crime was a form of rebellion.
Rebellion. Against what?
Against the whole system, like an unjust social order.
So they're saying instead of punishing people, we should be addressing the root causes of crime.
Right. Things like social inequality and economic exploitation makes you think, huh?
It does.
Yeah.
It's like, are we just putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem?
That's the challenge Foucault throws at us. He doesn't give easy answers, but he makes us ask the tough questions.
He's making us think critically about the whole purpose of prisms and what real justice looks like.
It all comes back to that idea of a disciplinary power we talked about earlier.
Right, that it's not just about prisons, it's in all parts of our lives.
Think about how our lives are structured by rules, schedules, expectations.
At work, at school, everywhere.
Foucault called these docile bodies. Like, we're trained to conform.
It's kind of depressing when you think about it like that.
But it's also about becoming aware of it, recognizing those subtle forms of power all around us.
So we can start to question them and maybe even resist them.
Exactly. It's about understanding how power operates, even in those invisible ways.
Foucault's work is like a wake-up call, isn't it?
It is. And it's particularly relevant when we think about how prisons and this whole carceral system shape our ideas of normal.
Like what's considered acceptable behavior and what's not.
Right. And then the system uses that power to control and punish those who don't fit in.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Foucault was really concerned about this process of labeling delinquency. He saw it as a way to manage and control certain groups of people.
And that control could take a lot of forms, right? Surveillance, imprisonment, even using people as informants.
It's a really complicated web of power.
It makes you wonder who really benefits from all of this.
And it's important to remember that this whole system often intersects with other social inequalities.
Like racism and classism.
Exactly. It's not just about individual choices, it's about these larger social forces at play.
So we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about solutions, right?
Absolutely. But before we go there, it's important to acknowledge that Foucault's work has its critics too.
Oh yeah, there are always different perspectives.
Some people question his historical accuracy. Others say he focuses too much on power and not enough on the experiences of those actually caught in the system.
It's good to hear those different viewpoints.
But even with those criticisms, Foucault's work is still so relevant today.
It sparks important conversations about punishment, power, and how we define deviance.
Okay, so with all that in mind, let's look at some specific examples that Foucault uses.
Sounds good.
Like, he talks about how public executions evolved over time.
Remember how he said the shift to prisons wasn't just about being more humane?
It was about a fundamental change in how punishment worked in society.
Public executions were all about spectacle, right? Pain, suffering, showing the power of the ruler.
It was a very public display of authority, a way to instill fear and deter crime.
Almost like a ritual,
Yeah.
right? Like society confronting its own darkness.
Exactly. But then things start to change as we move into the modern era.
Like, there's that description in the research of a penitentiary carriage.
Ah, yes. A way to transport prisoners discreetly, without all the spectacle.
It's like they were trying to make punishment invisible.
It's that shift from public display to private discipline that Foucault is talking about.
So punishment becomes less about outward shows of power and more about controlling the individual's mind and body.
And that's where the prison comes in, with its focus on isolation, surveillance, and reform.
It's not just about locking someone up, it's about reshaping them.
And remember, this shift is about more than just physical confinement.
It's about a whole new way of thinking about power, knowledge, and how we control people.
Foucault uses some pretty vivid language to describe this, like when he talks about the chain gang.
I remember that. He called it a festival of the departing convicts.
It was this chaotic spectacle that actually allowed for some resistance from the prisoners.
I love that quote from the source material. He called it a saturnalia of punishment, a penalty turned into a privilege.
It captures that strange mix of punishment and celebration that was part of public executions.
But as the system evolved, that public spectacle became a problem.
The authorities wanted more order, more control. They didn't want all that chaos and disruption.
So they shifted to things like the penitentiary carriage. It's like a mobile prison, all about surveillance and control.
Even though the carriage was only used for a short time, it represents this bigger change.
It's a symbol of that move towards discretion and control.
It's interesting how those anxieties around public executions, like the fear of disorder and resistance, are still relevant today.
Even though we don't have public hangings anymore, we still worry about those same things.
It speaks to these deeper issues of how we balance control and justice.
And how we deal with the visibility and invisibility of punishment.
We're still wrestling with those same tensions today.
Okay, this is a lot to take in, but I think I'm starting to understand what Foucault is getting at.
It's about seeing the prison not just as a building, but as a part of this much larger system of power.
It affects us in so many ways, even if we don't realize it.
And it's about understanding how power works, even in its most subtle forms.
This is why we do this deep dive, right? To challenge our assumptions and see the world in a new way.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. We're not just talking about prisons. We're talking about power and how it shapes our lives.
It's about understanding how we're all caught up in these systems of control.
And hopefully finding ways to resist them and create something better.
That's a good place to leave it for now. We'll continue this conversation in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
We've been talking about some pretty heady stuff today, all these systems of control and punishment. It's kind of a downer.
I hear you. It can be tough to confront this stuff.
But Foucault doesn't just leave us there, right? He also talks about ways to resist.
Yeah, absolutely. He believed that where there's power, there's always resistance.
So there's hope.
Always. And he points to historical examples like the worker movements we discussed.
They were criticizing the exploitation of prisoners, the link between poverty and crime.
They saw how the system was used to control the working class, and they weren't having it.
And some groups even saw crime itself as a form of rebellion.
Exactly. Like the Fourierists, they said crime was a pushback against an unjust system.
So instead of just punishing individuals, we should be looking at the bigger picture, the
Yeah.
social and economic factors that lead people to crime.
Exactly. It's about addressing the root causes, not just the symptoms.
Okay, but that's a pretty big challenge. Like, where do we even start?
Well, one thing Foucault emphasizes is the importance of challenging those dominant narratives.
You mean those stories that justify the carceral system? The ones that say prisons are the only answer?
Right. We need to dismantle those stories and expose the power dynamics behind them.
We need to show the human cost of mass incarceration, the impact it has on real people's lives.
And beyond just critiquing the system, we have to start imagining and building alternatives.
Like, what would a world without prisons actually look like?
It would mean investing in restorative justice programs, community-based solutions, things that actually address the underlying causes of crime.
It's about creating a society where everyone has genuine opportunities.
Yeah.
A chance to thrive, regardless of their past.
Exactly. Foucault reminds us that these systems of power aren't inevitable. They're human-made, which means we can change them.
We have the power to create a different future, one that's more just and humane.
A future where justice is about healing and transformation, not just punishment and control.
Okay, I'm feeling a little more optimistic now.
Me too. Because it's that vision of a better future that keeps us going.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been intense, but really eye-opening.
Foucault's work always challenges us to think differently, doesn't it?
It makes you question everything you thought you knew about prisons and the whole system.
It's about understanding how power works, even in those subtle, invisible ways.
And ultimately, it's about finding ways to resist and create a more just world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Foucault's Discipline and Punish. It's been a journey, folks.
It has, but the conversation doesn't end here.
Exactly. We encourage everyone listening to keep exploring these ideas. Think about what resonated with you, how Foucault's work connects to your own life and the world around you,
Keep asking those tough questions.
and keep diving deep.